Hello and welcome to the IChemE Safety Centre webinar. This is the second member webinar we have hosted and we plan to host many more in the future. My name is Trish Kerrin and I'm the Director of the IChemE Safety Centre. I joined IChemE to lead the development of the IChemE in January 2014. Prior to that I had a career working in engineering, operations and process safety in the oil and gas and chemical industries. The topic for this webinar is normalisation of deviance. As we progress through the webinar, you will be able to ask questions or make comments by typing in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please make sure you select entire audience so everyone can see your comments. We will endeavour to answer your questions both during and at the conclusion of the presentation. So what is normalisation of deviance? The concept of normalisation of deviance was raised by sociologist Diane Vaughan in her 1996 book, The Challenger Launch Decision. Following this and the Columbia incident, she was then invited to join the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. The concept of normalisation of deviance is basically not taking heed of warning signs because you just don't notice them as warning signs anymore. For example, you may have a piece of equipment that's constantly in an alarm state. You either stop noticing the alarm or justify that it's okay because it's a false alarm, rather than address what's causing it. You may miss the real alarm by always assuming it's false. We're going to talk a little bit about the Columbia Space Shuttle as a case study here. And this case study has been chosen to highlight the factors around normalisation of deviance, as it's a very clearly documented incident in the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report, which was published in 2003. Columbia was on its 28th flight and it was the 113th Space Shuttle mission. It was designated Space Transportation System STS-107. It was a long mission of 16 days in orbit. STS-107 was initially scheduled for launch in May 2000, but this was delayed until January 2003. For various reasons, shuttle launches can be delayed over time, and they basically maintain their original designation. So in this instance, for example, STS-112 flew before STS-107. During the launch, when the external tank disconnected from the orbiter, foam insulation broke away from what's called the bipod ramp and struck the left wing of the orbiter. During the investigation into the incident, it was determined this foam damaged the thermal protection on the orbiter. The thermal protection is designed to protect the orbiter during the extreme heat build-up that occurs on re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. This table, taken from the Columbia Accident Investigation Board Report, Volume 1, shows a history of major foam debris strikes on space shuttles. There were 14 instances in all when significant damage occurred or there was a large foam loss. Looking at mission STS-27R with Atlantis, the Atlantis orbiter suffered a near burn-through event when it lost a thermal tile due to excessive foam debris strikes. On mission STS-35, this appears to be when NASA started to define debris hits as a reuse or turnaround issue rather than just a safety of flight issue. Mission STS-50 appears to be when debris strikes become an accepted risk in the organisation. STS-56 is when strikes are now considered commonplace and acceptable. Mission STS-112 also suffered a significant debris strike, but in this instance it was not even considered to be an anomaly because they are now at a situation where foam strikes are expected on launch. And finally, mission STS-107 in January of 2003 when the Columbia launch occurred. The Columbia broke up on re-entry after suffering tile damage from the foam debris impact and a burn-through event which led to the orbiter becoming unstable. The shuttle program was delayed in its early phases due to issues with the thermal tiles. In fact, as they were developing the design of the orbiter, they took a very long time to install the tiles, and they would often fall off after installation and have to be reinstalled. This led to new adhesives being developed to ensure that the tiles actually stayed in place. Damage to the thermal tiles was initially a concern to NASA, and they started to develop a method for repairing the tiles in orbit. But this was unsuccessful, and eventually they cancelled these efforts. They were also unable to stop the foam shedding issue. So interestingly, rather than focusing on making the orbiter more resistant to impact strikes, they actually put a lot of effort into analysing the probability of damage. They then didn't do anything with this risk analysis, they basically just analysed it. The repair program, as well as a visual inspection of the orbiter after launch, was reinitiated following the Columbia loss. The visual inspections were achieved in the last launches of the shuttle system, either via satellite, ground-based imagery, or if the orbiter was docking at the International Space Station, it was observed by the space station crews visually before docking to see whether there was any damage to be concerned about, and therefore potentially repair whilst in orbit. This image here shows you the space shuttle in its entirety. So the space shuttle term refers to the orbiter, the external tank, and the solid rocket boosters. The orange tank in the middle is the external tank, and the small red circle up the top is where the bipod ramp is. This is where the foam breaks off when the shuttle actually launches and the external tank separates. The red circle down towards the bottom is the debris strike region where the Columbia was actually struck with the foam that had broken away. And this is actually Columbia on its launch pad prior to launch in 2003. The Space Shuttle design project started in earnest in 1972. It was initially designed to be a routine form of transport to orbit, with around 50 flights per year and commercial contracts to launch satellites to assist with its funding. However, by 1989, it was only conducting 24 flights per year. The budgeting for the system was overrun, and it was not generating the expected revenue due to capability issues. The shuttle, however, was declared operational in 1982 and ready to provide economic and routine access to space. This was more for political purposes because the system was proving difficult to operate, with more maintenance required between flights than had been expected. Rather than needing the 10 working days projected in 1975 to process a returned orbiter for its next flight, by the end of 1985, an average of 67 days had elapsed before a shuttle was ready for launch. The original design specification also did not include protection from debris strikes. Therefore, the occurrence of a debris strike was a violation or deviance from the specification. In fact, even as the shuttle orbits Earth whilst in orbit, it actually orbits in a reverse and upside down direction to protect its sensitive areas so that it doesn't suffer debris impact from anything in the Earth's orbit as well. Normalisation of deviance in NASA predated the Columbia incident. There are striking similarities with the cultural acceptance of deviation that extended back to the Challenger incident. Challenger, or mission STS-51L, had been delayed several times and pressure was mounting to launch. There was also a lot of media focus and the Space Shuttle program was striving to become more relevant. So some of you may remember that Space Shuttle Challenger actually had a middle school teacher on board because they were going to try and raise the profile of the space program by engaging with students and schools all over America. The schedule was put ahead of engineering considerations that the ambient temperature was outside previous experience and the O-rings became brittle in lower temperatures. The chief engineer was actually told to take his engineering hat off and put his management on to make a launch decision when the engineers from the O-ring manufacturer raised concerns about the temperature of launch. The NASA safety program was ineffective and remained silent. The onus was on the contracting engineers to prove that it was unsafe rather than a focus on proving it was safe. Prior to STS-51L, when the O-ring began behaving in unexpected ways, rather than testing the joint, NASA and Morton Thiokol, the manufacturer, came to see the deviation as an acceptable flight risk, a violation of design that could be tolerated. The Challenger investigation also found that the safety management system, in particular, elements involving problem reporting, trend analysis, interpretation of criticality, and involvement of experts in critical decisions were all severely lacking. Thinking about your own organisations, do you focus on proving systems and actions are unsafe or proving they are safe? And it's a very important distinction between those two. While there were recommendations to address the cultural issues following Challenger, the human spaceflight area of NASA remained largely unaffected. Human spaceflight was the area responsible for managing the shuttle program. This led to inadequate concerns over deviation from expected performance, silent safety program, and schedule pressure being entrenched in the organisation. This was compounded by budget pressure and a reduction in staffing that had occurred. During all of this, culturally, there was a hubris associated with success. Regardless of the Challenger incident itself, this was the organisation that had put a man on the moon and developed the space shuttle program. This meant it was not possible for them to believe failure could occur in their culture. The culture rejected criticism, recommendations, and externally imposed changes. The findings of both Challenger and Columbia investigations are similar from a cultural perspective. Very clearly a failure to learn there. Some thermal protection areas are so fragile they can be damaged with a fingernail. Engineers were quoted as saying that if they had known the external tank was going to produce the debris shower that occurred on launch, they would have had a very difficult time clearing Columbia for launch. Over the life of the program up to STS-107, orbiters landed with an average of 143 divots on upper and lower surfaces, with 31 of these averaging over 1 inch in one dimension. Efforts were made to modify the foam and bipod connectors, but when this proved too difficult, the work ceased. Eventually, the damage was seen as merely a delay in preparation for the next flight, rather than a safety of flight issue for the current flight, because after all, the previous orbiters had all returned safely. STS-112, which flew a few months before STS-107, suffered a bipod ramp foam shedding incident, which resulted in a 3-inch by 4-inch gouge in the foam on one of the solid rocket boosters. This was a very big warning signal that was normalised. It was not even recognised as an in-flight anomaly. With each successful landing, engineers and managers regarded the foam shedding as inevitable and unlikely to impact on safety. That is, it had become an acceptable risk. As the acceptance of debris strikes increased, the way in which they were handled changed significantly. After the discovery of a debris strike on Flight Day 2 of STS-27R with Atlantis in 1988, the crew was immediately directed to inspect the orbiter using its space arm. Whilst they were able to view some of the damage, they weren't actually able to see that there was a missing tile. The location of where the tile was lost was fortunately a much thicker aluminium plate, which prevented a total burn through, though the orbiter skin was damaged on return to the atmosphere. The engineers were surprised at the extent of the damage when that shuttle actually landed. 707 impacts, with 298 of them greater than 1 inch, and a missing tile. As the commander had said, it looked like she'd been blasted with a shotgun. 14 years later, when a debris strike was discovered on Flight Day 2 of STS-107 with Columbia, shuttle program management declined to inform the crew or have them inspect the orbiter for damage. They declined multiple requests for on-orbit imaging to inspect the tiles on the orbiter, and ultimately they discounted the possibility of a burn-through. Interestingly, debris strikes continued to be an issue for the shuttle program up until its final mission. This photo shows some thermal tile damage from the final shuttle mission, STS-135, with Atlantis. The orbiter Atlantis is on display at Kennedy Space Center in the conditions she landed in, and this sort of damage is very evident if you ever have the opportunity to see one of the shuttles on display. It was standard protocol for high-resolution footage of launches to be examined for anomalies. The team reviewing the footage were concerned there may have been damage to the thermal tiles due to the debris strike. Multiple requests were made to inspect the orbiter during the mission. The first was a request for the crew to do a visual inspection. That request to the Engineering Directorate was never answered. 3 separate requests were made over several days to obtain high-resolution footage of the orbiter in orbit to determine if there was any damage of concern. Each of these requests was eventually rejected as being unnecessary. Without images, the debris assessment team could only estimate using mathematical models, which were actually not designed for that purpose, to postulate potential damage. It was estimated that there may be localised heat damage, but they could not definitively say structural damage would occur. Orbiters are monitored with an exclusion zone while in orbit. On flight day 2 of the mission, an additional object appeared in orbit with the orbiter for almost an hour. This was detected via the exclusion zone monitoring. It was not possible to conclusively determine what it was, but the size and shape was consistent with a reinforced carbon-carbon panel fragment. It was possible that this was when the damaged tile fell off the orbiter. The crew were informed of the debris strike on flight day 8, and they were told it was not a concern and they had nothing to worry about. The only reason they were actually informed is because they were about to do media interviews on flight day 10, and it had become public knowledge throughout the US that there was some concern about a debris strike. So they were informed so that they weren't surprised in an interview when they were asked about it. Foam impacts had been normalised. They were a maintenance turnaround issue rather than a threat to safety. It was an identified and acceptable risk, not a flight safety issue. We can consider that this is actually similar to the Pike River coal mine explosion, where excessive methane levels were seen to be a production-related issue rather than a safety one. High levels had been accepted. The Columbia orbiter was unique. She was the first orbiter to be launched, and she had additional instrumentation to validate performance and design. Over her life of 28 missions, the additional instrumentation began to fail. As it was installed for design validation, it was not maintained or repaired on failure. Failed instrumentation meant results could not be relied upon, even though the results were logged. Unexpected results from the sensors in her left wing were assumed to be spurious, though they may have been an indication of the impending breakup. It's worth considering how your facilities are instrumented. What are your instruments telling you? Are you measuring the right things? What are you doing with the data? How are your instruments being maintained? Is data being ignored because it might be spurious, or from instruments that are considered no longer necessary? There have been several incidents where elements of normalisation of deviance have contributed to the outcome. A selection across different industries have been chosen here. The Challenger Space Shuttle in 1986, when the Space Shuttle exploded 73 seconds after launch with the loss of all 7 crew. The Gretley coal mine flood in 1996, when an underground mine flooded when they broke through to some disused and flooded mine tunnels. There were 4 fatalities. In 2005, the BP Texas City refinery, with the overfilling of the raffinate splitter tower resulting in loss of containment and subsequent explosion, and 15 fatalities. In Macondo in 2010, with the well blowout resulting in 11 fatalities, significant oil spill and the sinking of the rig. The Pike River coal mine in 2010, 29 miners died when they were trapped in the underground mine after a series of explosions due to methane buildup. DuPont toxic chemical releases in 2010, resulting in one fatality at the Bell, West Virginia site. And something a little more left field, the Costa Concordia in 2012, the grounding and sinking of the passenger ship with the loss of 32 lives. Let's go into these in a bit more detail to highlight the normalisation of deviance that occurred. So a little bit more on the Challenger space shuttle. The O-rings in the solid rocket boosters were designed to create a pressure seal to contain the solid rocket motors. Over a series of previous flights, it was noted that the O-rings were being eroded during the launch process. This became a known design flaw. It was also known that the O-rings performed worse when it became brittle under colder ambient conditions. This design flaw became acceptable to NASA as there had been no negative consequences of the known issue. At the time of launching Challenger, the ambient temperature was lower than previous launches. The Morton Thiokol engineers who designed the O-rings were concerned that this was outside of their known experience. They actually recommended against launch in the predicted weather conditions. However, the deviance of O-rings being eroded had been so normalised in the organisation that the decision to launch was made. The risk was deemed acceptable because nothing bad had happened previously. The results, as we know, was the destruction of the orbiter and the loss of the entire crew shortly after launch. The Gretley mine, near Newcastle in New South Wales, was located in an area rich with black coal. Collieries had been present in the region since the 1800s. Initially, the mine at Gretley was quite some distance away from old abandoned tunnels, which over the years had flooded. In 1994, the decision was made to expand the Gretley mine, and drawings of the old tunnels were obtained. These were unfortunately incorrect, and as a result, the abandoned tunnels were 100 metres closer than thought. In the weeks leading up to the incident, warning signs began to appear that the miners were getting closer to the abandoned tunnels. However, these warnings were ultimately dismissed. The district was typically a wet one. However, Gretley mine was always considered to be a drier mine. In fact, it did not have pumps installed. When the miners started to report seepage and accumulation of water, it should have been a warning that they may have been getting closer to flooded tunnels. Over the 2 weeks leading up to the flood, there were reports of nuisance water. In one report, the question was actually asked, "We're not close to the old mine, are we?" The increased presence of water was normalised as the coal seam just giving out a considerable amount of water. The presence of water in this increasing quantity was deviant, but was normalised as nothing to be concerned about. BP Texas City Refinery. The isomerization unit was being restarted after a shutdown. The procedure required pumping of raffinate through the splitter tower. However, it was common practice to deviate from the procedure and block flow out of the tower. This was done to avoid losing liquid level in the tower during startup, which may have damaged equipment. The previous experience by the operators was that they could get sudden drops in the level in the tower, so they adapted the way they started it to compensate. Compounding this issue was the acceptability to start the tower, even though there were reported malfunctions with the level gauges and pressure control valve on the tower. Another deviation from procedures was the lack of additional staff during startup of the isomerization unit as required by BP safety guidelines. The tower overflowed to a blowdown drum rather than to a flare system. This was despite numerous recommendations to install the flare system. The blowdown drum was a deviation from current accepted engineering design and had resulted in numerous releases to atmosphere of flammable liquids in the past. The Deepwater Horizon drill rig had just completed drilling the Macondo well and was preparing to leave the area. This process included completing the cement sealing of the well and removal of heavy drilling mud from the riser. Provided the cement sealing was successful, removing the mud would not result in any safety issues. Once the cement sealing had been completed, it was declared a success by the engineers undertaking it. This declaration set up the expectation that all subsequent tests would show it had been a success. The focus of well integrity tests then shifted to confirm that it was sealed rather than to investigate whether it was sealed. Yet again, a very subtle difference in thought. However, in this instance, the cement sealing had been unsuccessful and the well was not sealed. This highlighted the concept of confirmation bias as well, where people have a subconscious preference to look for information that confirms their beliefs rather than refutes them. Normalisation of deviance came into play during the confirmation bias that occurred with the well integrity testing. Warning signs showing that cement sealing was unsuccessful were justified away. The explanations that did not call into doubt the integrity, of the cement sealing. This can be a challenge in interpreting the warning signs. Some explanations of them may be benign, but if a confirmation bias is already established that there is success, the deviation may be normalised. The Pike River coal mine was an underground mine and it shipped its first coal in February 2010, so at the time of the explosion in November 2010 it was still a very new mine. It did, however, have some very unusual design features. The main ventilation fan was located underground rather than above, which is the conventional design. This difference contributed to the ventilation system deficiencies, which meant it was not able to handle the level of methane being liberated by the mining process employed. This was exacerbated by the hydromining, which was liberating higher levels of methane in this particular mine. The performance of the ventilation system was seen as an operations issue that impacted production and not safety. This was because the accumulation of methane triggered production stoppages. Because of the focus on production, some methane detectors were actually bypassed to prevent these stoppages. Although the levels of methane were manually recorded on a shift-by-shift basis, but no action was taken when these readings consistently showed excessive levels. The deviance of high methane levels was normalised and mining continued. It's not known what the ignition source was for the initial explosion, and after many years, despite the attempts to recover the remains of the miners, their bodies remain in the mine. The decision to cease attempting to extract them was made in December 2014. In 2010, the DuPont Bell, West Virginia facility suffered a series of significant incidents. The CSB chose to investigate them over the concern that 3 very significant incidents could occur over a 2-day period. The first release was of methyl chloride via a ruptured bursting disc. This then allowed the substance to leak back into the building for 5 days through a poorly designed vent before it was discovered. The bursting disc had sensors connected to it. However, from experience, they were unreliable, so the alarms were just assumed to be false or a nuisance. Prior to this incident, though, new, more reliable sensors had been installed. This hadn't been communicated to the operators and they hadn't been trained on the new sensors. So the alarms were still assumed to be false. The alarms were normalised. The second release was of oleum from a sample line through corroded pipework. Though they had identified corrosion a year earlier after a different leak and made recommendations for thickness monitoring program, it had not been implemented at the time of this incident. The third release was when a hose containing phosgene burst, spraying an operator. Phosgene is a highly toxic substance that attacks the mucous membranes of the body, and though the worker initially seemed okay, he did go to hospital for observation and later died in hospital. The phosgene was extracted from a canister into the process via a stainless steel braided Teflon lined hose. Given the permeability of Teflon to phosgene, the hoses were to be replaced every 30 days. However, at the time of the incident, they had not been changed for approximately 7 months. This was because the maintenance system which prompted the change-out had been changed and the new system was not sending reminders. The normalisation of deviance, however, occurred when earlier that day another phosgene hose had failed in service. This provided a warning signal to the operators, but no checks were done on the other phosgene hoses. It was assumed that everything was still okay, so there was no checks and no replacement of the hoses prior to this incident occurring. The Costa Concordia cruise ship. This ship struck rocks and eventually sank when it sailed at high speed too close to an island in a manoeuvre called a salute. The reason for a salute is usually to give passengers and people... I believe we're now back online. Apologies for that interruption. I'm not sure what happened with the audio. What I might do is just go back a couple of incidents. I'm not sure at which point we actually dropped out. I believe it was the DuPont facility. So I'm going to go back to the start of the DuPont incident again, and my apologies for that technical glitch. The CSB chose to investigate the Bell facility over concern that 3 significant incidents could occur over a 2-day period. The first release was of methyl chloride via a ruptured bursting disc. This then allowed the substance to leak back into the building for approximately 5 days through a poorly designed vent prior to it being discovered. The bursting disc had sensors connected to it, however they were unreliable, so alarms were assumed to be false or nuisance. Prior to the incident though, new, more reliable sensors had been installed, but the alarms were still assumed to be false. These alarms were normalised. The second release was of oleum from a sample line through corroded pipework. Though they had identified the corrosion a year earlier after a different leak and made recommendations for thickness monitoring program, this had not been implemented at the time the incident occurred. The third release was when a hose containing phosgene burst, spraying an operator. Phosgene attacks the mucous membranes of the body and it is a highly toxic substance. Although the worker initially seemed okay, he later died in hospital. The phosgene was extracted from a canister into the process via stainless steel braided Teflon-lined hoses. Given the permeability of Teflon to phosgene, the hoses were to be replaced every 30 days. However, at the time of the incident, they had not been changed for approximately 7 months. This was because the maintenance system which prompted their change-out had been changed and the new system was not providing reminders. The normalisation of deviance, however, occurred when earlier that day another phosgene hose failed in service. This warning sign did not trigger checking and replacing of the other hoses. On to the Costa Concordia. The Costa Concordia cruise ship struck rocks and eventually sank when it sailed at high speed too close to an island in a manoeuvre called a salute. The reason for their salute is usually to thrill passengers and people on shore at how close the ship is. According to the prosecution of the captain of the Costa Concordia over the previous few months in Italy, there does appear to have been a history of Costa ships performing salutes over many, many years. This deviant activity may have been normalised in the company culture. The captain was charged with a range of offences including manslaughter and deserting his post after he left the ship while the evacuation was still underway. In February 2012 he was found guilty and sentenced to 16 years. However, in Italy the verdict is not considered final until after all his appeals are over. These appeals are still ongoing. Measuring safety performance and success by recording the number of incidents that occur can embed normalisation of deviance. Logically, the absence of one thing is not proof of the presence of another. A lack of incidents is not evidence that the workplace is safe. There may be a situation where the lack of reported incidents is evidence of normalisation of deviance and nothing has gone wrong yet. It does not mean that nothing will go wrong in the future. Consider how you monitor safety performance in your own organisation. Are you measuring success by the absence of failure or actually by the presence of success? This is where lead metrics are so important. We're about to do a poll question now. So shortly a window will pop up on your screen and you'll be able to select a response to the question. Do you have systems in place to identify when deviance may become normalised? You'll be able to select yes, no or don't know. And we cannot tell who has submitted each answer. As you answer the poll, some questions for you to consider. Do your engineers make clear requests of what they're after? How do people making the decisions ensure they understand the consequences of those decisions? How are dissenting views handled? Do you assume previous successes are a justification to keep going? Or do you prove it as safe? Is the absence of failure seen as proof of success? So it looks like we have a few people still coming in with that poll, so I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay. So let's take a look at these results. So we've actually seen 25% of you saying that yes, you do have systems in place to identify when deviance may have become normalised, and 75% saying no. So thank you for that feedback. For those of you that answered, the 25% that answered that you do have systems in place to identify when deviance has become normalised, I've got another question for you then, and that is, how effective have these systems been? So I'll give you a chance to answer those questions again. So questions to consider as you answer this time. Does the system address confirmation bias? For example, no images of the shuttle were requested because they were convinced they did not need them. They looked for data to justify their opinion rather than challenging it. This was also seen in Macondo. The results of the well integrity testing were misinterpreted in justifying that the cement job was secure because it thought it had to be a good cement job. So far as that poll comes in, we're seeing a lot of people saying that where they did have processes in place, they're mostly effective, though some don't quite know at this stage. So I'll just give this poll another few seconds. Okay, we'll close that off there. So what we're seeing here is that for those of you that said you did have systems in place to identify deviance, about 75% of you are saying that you believe those systems are effective, and about 25% unsure. So I think that's an interesting picture to see how well we think some of our systems are working, in fact. So this now actually concludes the technical aspect of the presentation. So I'd like to now move to any questions or comments that you may have. So understanding that we did have a period of time there where we lost audio apparently. And so I'm just going to go back through a couple of the questions and comments that were put in. Was there a documented link between tiles disengaging or falling off and a major accident? There was certainly the documented link from the perspective that the Atlantis shuttle had had a near burn-through event, and it was purely by chance that the tile that fell off came from a region where the hull of the aircraft was actually much thicker. So it suffered significant heat damage, but it didn't have a total burn-through and loss of structural integrity. What those systems are for the 25% that had systems. So that's actually a really good question. For those of you that did have those systems in place, are you able to actually just jot down in that chat box for us exactly what the what sort of systems you're using, so that we can try and understand what others are using and share that learning? So, you know, what are your learnings about how to share and guard against normalisation of deviance in your organisations, and how well is that working for you? So do we have any suggestions from people around that sort of information? Or any other questions at all, or comments? So what I might do then is move on to talk about some of the upcoming webinars that we have, and if you have any questions or comments or suggestions around how the how people's areas work, you can then put them through. So I've just seen we've had some comments come through. And I've just lost them on my screen somehow. So I'll get those back in a second. On the 23rd of March this year, we have a webinar coming up talking about the BP Texas City refinery. That actually marks its 10th anniversary. We've been fortunate enough to secure Dr. Paul Thibault to discuss that particular incident. Paul was actually a member of the Baker panel, which was the panel that was developed to review the cultural aspects of the US refineries following that particular incident. Following that, we'll have another one in June where we're actually going to be talking about the lead process safety metrics project that we've been working on in the Safety Centre and where we've got to. And then in November, on the anniversary of the Pike River mine explosion, the 5th anniversary, we'll have a session talking about that as well. In terms of the ideas and comments that people have come through with, things such as multi-tiered risk assessments of deviations is one area that, or one model that people are using, and sign off by competent technical authorities to ensure that they're getting broad input into particular topics. Another question has come through, would it be correct to say that people may not have been able to construct the Columbia disaster before the incident in any hazard study? That's an interesting question, and I would perhaps suggest that they would have been able to, given the previous history that they'd had, and given certainly Columbia was by no means the first major debris strike that they'd had, and also, as I said, with the Atlantis shuttle that had launched several years earlier, there was certainly great concern at that launch that they could have an issue where they had thermal damage sufficient that that shuttle may not have been able to return. And that's certainly very clearly seen by the fact that as soon as they immediately discovered that they had some foam shedding issues, that they straight away had the crew inspect the shuttle, which, as I mentioned, is quite different to the response to Columbia. they had got to the point in Colombia where they just believed it was not possible to have the issue, as opposed to looking back into their own history and seeing that they had very clear warning signs that had occurred, and even the previous launch where a significant chunk was taken out of one of the solid rocket boosters by the debris shower that occurred. I'd certainly recommend people read or take a quick look at least through some of the executive summary of the Columbia report. It's a very, very interesting report, and it's not purely technical based on the idea of flight and how those flight structures work. It is really more around the cultural deficiencies that occurred within that organisation and how it has subsequently changed. It's a very interesting study of a culture where there is no concept of failure occurring, and they had that in a series of different incidents because they could not conceive failure given some of the successes that they had had in the past. I'd also recommend, if anyone gets the chance to visit a place like Kennedy Space Centre, it is a very, very interesting place to visit to see the development of their engineering over many, many years, but also there are still elements of that same culture around not being able to conceive that something could go wrong, given the history that they had. Now, we don't appear to have any more questions or comments coming through. So apologies once again for that loss of audio during the presentation, and I hope I managed to go back to the right point so you could hear the rest of it. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available for viewing in your organisations after this event, and that will be available through the Safety Centre website at www.icmesafetycentre.org, and in the supporters area on the menu you can click straight through to the webinars and you'll be able to see it there and view it. Also, if you have any future comments around webinars, please contact us at safetycentre@icme.org. If you have any ideas of how to improve these, obviously with technology is an important one, but also for the benefit or particular topics that you'd like looked at, or if you'd like to be added to our email notification list so you get notified directly. I've just had one last question come through asking what time will the BP Texas City session be. Off the top of my head, from memory at the moment, I believe it's about 10 a.m. Melbourne time, which is 7 a.m. Perth time, and part of that is to be able to match in the time zones so that Paul can join us for that discussion. I have just seen one more question come through, sorry, that I have missed. How does industry find the balance between rewarding success versus rewarding identification of deficiencies in safety systems and deviation on the basis of design? That is a very, very good question. Does anyone have any thoughts that they'd like to actually send through to assist with that question? I think it is a very challenging balance to go through, and I think it's all part of ensuring that you've established an appropriate culture in an organisation to make sure that you do have people accountable for what occurs. You do need to reward and celebrate success to a certain degree, in my experience, but you also need to make sure that there's a real focus on where issues are occurring, that we're not hiding them or failing to see them, more to the point, as we endeavour to improve what's going on. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about how to balance that rewarding success versus deficiencies? Another very interesting way I've seen it referred to is a comment around celebrating the red on the scorecard and challenging the green. So really sending the message out there that you're interested in understanding and you want to see what the deficiencies are, and challenge when no deficiencies are found, because no system that a human is involved with is free of deficiencies. Okay, we haven't got any more comments come through at this point in time on questions. Right, I've just got another one. Hopkins has a good theory: reward frontline people for reporting incidents and senior managers for safety outputs, e.g. incident rates. Is that from Hopkins' new book that's just come out in his discussions around reward systems for bonus structures, etc., and how they potentially drive unintended behaviours and consequences in an organisation? Okay, no, I've just got that answer through. No, he believes that was out of the Disastrous Decisions book, which was the Macondo review that Hopkins did. Thank you for that. So there is certainly some interesting areas. I think I have some concerns around the idea of the rewarding of management for the safety outputs being the injury rates, because that comes back to that very topic of looking at whether we are measuring the success of something by the absence of something else. So the absence of injuries or leaks does not mean that we're not about to have one, or that we're not about to see something go wrong quite significantly. So I think we need to be very careful and start to move away from the idea of rewarding people for lagging indicator results. I think we need to be moving far more towards the leading space to ensure that we actually see what's going on at that point. Okay, thank you all very much for your attendance. I certainly hope that you found this webinar both interesting and thought-provoking. Just got another comment come through, sorry. I think you're right in rewarding the red warning signs and completing RCA on the warning signs before things go wrong. And I think that's a very, very good comment. It's around how do we then strike that balance from the busyness that we all exist in to make sure that we give those areas the appropriate attention and understand that the warning sign has existed and appeared, and also that we review it to understand how we can address it. Because there is definitely a balance that does have to come through around how we can actually manage our day-to-day business, because we all still have jobs to do and we all still need to understand these things and work through them. So thank you very much for that comment. As I mentioned, this recording will be on the ICME Safety Centre website, so I would like to sign off there and thank you all very much for your participation today. Thank you.